Hey guys, tonight we're taking a quiet step into one of the most infamous haunted objects ever whispered about around campfires and movie screens, the Annabelle doll. But not the Hollywood version with porcelain skin and crackling laughter. No, the one that really exists. The one with a faded smile, stuffed arms, and a history soaked in fear. She's not resting behind a pane of theatrical glass. She's in a real museum, in a real case, and according to some, she's still very much aware of who walks by. Imagine walking into a room and seeing her not thrown in the corner, not propped up neatly, but sitting on your bed, facing the door, as if she's been waiting for you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because tonight's story doesn't care if it's morning or midnight. It just wants you quiet, still, listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with an apartment, simple, second floor, wood floors with that gentle creak. Two women sharing the space, nursing students, often away, always tired. The kind of people who don't go looking for strange things. Which made it all the worse when strange things came looking for them. The doll arrived as a gift, a cheerful surprise from a mother to her daughter. Something retro, sweet, harmless. A big Raggedy Ann doll, all red yarn hair and stitched-on smile. You might have passed one in a thrift shop without a second glance. They place her on the bed like a decoration, but soon she starts to move. At first, it's small, a leg bent that wasn't, a head slightly tilted to the left. They joke about it, blame each other. The kind of harmless weirdness you forget about by morning. But it doesn't stop. In fact, it escalates. One day, she's in the bedroom. The next, they find her sitting in the hallway. Then the kitchen. Then propped up on the couch, with her arms gently resting on the cushions, like she's been watching the door. No windows open, no roommates home, just the doll, and the slow, creeping chill that follows her. They begin finding notes. Small pieces of parchment, not notebook paper, not something they had in the house. Scrawled on them in a childish hand are messages like, "Help us and save Lou." Lou is their friend, close, protective, a little skeptical of the whole thing. Until one night, Lou wakes up to find he can't move. His body is frozen, paralyzed in the dark, and standing at the edge of his bed, Annabelle. Not sitting, not slumped, standing. Before he can scream, he feels pressure on his chest, then claws. Deep, invisible scratches tear across his skin. When he's finally able to move, he checks the room. No one there, except the doll, back in her seat, smiling. They're terrified now. It's no longer a prank or oddity, it's presence. Thick and heavy and real. Desperate, they contact a medium. She comes. She listens. She performs a seance. And the message is gentle. The spirit is named Annabelle Higgins, the medium says. A little girl who died nearby, lonely, harmless, just looking for a place to stay. A little girl drawn to the kindness of the women who live here. They're moved. They say yes. They tell the spirit she can stay in the doll. But here's the thing about invitations. Once you give them, you can't take them back. And not everything that says please is telling the truth. Some say the real terror begins after they grant permission. Because now, the activity gets bolder. Footsteps, knocks, cold spots, and always the feeling that someone's just around the corner, waiting, watching. You sit back now, picturing that doll. Wide stitched eyes, head too soft to hold shape, arms limp but always positioned just so. And in your gut, you understand something. This isn't a story about a haunted toy, it's a story about an opening, and whatever came through it was never a child. You try to sleep, but the doll won't leave your mind. That silly smile. The way her head seems to follow your thoughts even when you're not looking at her. In your dreams, she doesn't speak, but she's always there, just like she was in that apartment. Donna and Angie, those were the two roommates, were no longer giggling over Annabelle's antics. They started walking more carefully through the apartment, checking corners, glancing over their shoulders when turning off lights. That's what fear does. It doesn't need to scream. It just needs to settle in. And it had, especially with Lou. He'd always been the one who brushed things off, the one who told Donna to get rid of the doll, said it gave him a bad feeling from the beginning. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but whatever lived inside Annabelle, it didn't like Lou. And Lou, well, he didn't like her either. One night, Lou stayed over, He'd planned to talk to Donna and Angie the next morning, to really push them to get rid of the thing. He slept on the couch in the living room, keeping one wary eye on the hallway where the doll usually sat. In the middle of the night, he woke to a noise, a soft rustling sound, like fabric dragging along the ground. Then, a click, a faint whisper of the doorknob turning. He sat up, and there, standing just inside the dark room, was Annabelle. Her arms were limp at her sides, her red yarn hair casting strange shadows in the low light, and somehow she was upright, without anyone holding her. Now, this is where versions of the story begin to differ. Some say Lou blacked out, that he woke up hours later with deep claw marks across his chest. Others say he lunged at the doll in a rage, swearing he heard a laugh just before everything went black. But one thing's consistent. When he opened his shirt, there were 3 long, vertical slashes down his chest, burning and bleeding. They faded within days, as if healed by something unnatural, but the fear stayed. And Lou, he never set foot in that apartment again. That was the turning point. Annabelle wasn't a spirit anymore, not to them. She was something else. So Donna and Angie did what you or I might do if we were just brave enough, or just scared enough. They reached out for help. That's when Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the picture. You've probably heard of them famous demonologists, ghost hunters, whatever name you want to give them. Some call them heroes, others performers. But when they walked into that apartment, the air changed. Not just according to the girls, but even Ed later admitted something felt wrong before they'd even opened the door. The Warrens listened, studied, watched. Then came the verdict. This wasn't a human spirit. It wasn't Annabelle Higgins, or at least, not really. It was a demonic entity. One that used the story of a little girl to manipulate the roommates. It had tricked them into granting permission, and now it was getting stronger. The doll was never possessed. It was a conduit, a tool, and the thing using it wanted more than just attention. It wanted a host. Think about that. Something malevolent, pretending to be a child, just long enough to be let inside. Then, once you've welcomed it, once you've said you can stay, that's when the mask falls off, and the scratching starts. The dreams start, the laughter in the hallway, the shadows that don't leave even when the lights are on. The Warrens asked to take the doll with them. They believed if left in the apartment any longer, someone would die. That wasn't drama. That was their honest assessment. Donna and Angie didn't argue. They handed the doll over. But Annabelle didn't like being taken, and the trip to the Warren household was far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. You try to imagine the back seat of that car. Sunlight streaming in, windows rolled up, Lorraine watching the rearview mirror more than the road, Ed muttering prayers under his breath as the engine suddenly stalls. Again and again. Each time the engine dies, Annabelle is sitting still. But the air, it's electric, like the moment before lightning hits. The Warrens were no strangers to cursed objects. Their home was practically a vault of them items removed from homes, churches, crime scenes. But this one, Annabelle, she was different. On the ride back, Ed didn't let her rest freely in the back seat. He secured her with seatbelts. He sprinkled the area with holy water. He spoke prayers, not loud and commanding, but steady, as if trying to lull something back to sleep. Did it help? Hard to say. Because despite the precautions, the car stalled 3 separate times. Once while merging onto a highway ramp, once as a truck nearly hit them, and once, most chilling of all, as they passed a church. Each time, Ed restarted the car. Each time, he refused to look in the rearview mirror. You picture it now, that drive. The way Lorraine might have turned her head slowly to check on the doll. That silent stare Annabelle gave back. Not aggressive, not wide-eyed, just aware, like she knew exactly what they were doing. Like she let them. Because the real power in her story isn't the scare, it's the control. Back at the Warrens' home, Annabelle wasn't simply dropped on a shelf. No, Ed and Lorraine built a case for her. Literally. A wooden cabinet, reinforced with glass, and later blessed regularly by a priest. The sign reads, "Positively, do not open." You'd think that would be enough. But the thing about people, they don't always listen. There's one tale that still clings to the museum walls like dust in the corners. A young man came with his girlfriend, a motorcyclist, cocky, laughing loudly as he pointed at Annabelle. He knocked on the glass, mocked the warnings, said it was fake. He even dared the doll to prove him wrong. The staff asked him to leave. He rode off on his bike that night and didn't make it home. Some say he lost control. Others say it was just a terrible accident. But his girlfriend survived, and she remembers exactly what happened. She says he laughed one final time, then the brakes failed. Coincidence? Some say yes. But the Warrens didn't believe in accidents like that. Not when they followed mocking, disrespect, provocation. They believed Annabelle, or rather, what used her, could still reach out. Not often, not predictably, but when it wanted to, visitors continued to report strange sensations around her case. The glass fogging up on its own, a low tapping sound that echoed when no one else was near. Even Lorraine said she never stayed in the museum at night, not if she could avoid it. There's a quote from her that lingers. "It's not the doll that frightens me, it's the lie it tells." Let's pause for a second, because maybe right now you're wondering if she's so dangerous, why not destroy her? Burn the doll, tear it apart. Well, the Warrens tried. They claimed that items used by demonic forces become attached to the spirit world, that destroying them might not end the threat, only release it. So, instead of risking that, they contain it, bless it, seal it, warn others. That's what the museum is, a warning more than a display. And Annabelle? She's not resting. She's waiting. You feel it now, don't you? The quiet that settles in when something's watching. Not menacing, just curious. She wants to be known, not feared, not at first, just seen. Because once you believe in her, once you give her that crack in your certainty, well, she doesn't need your soul. She just needs a place to sit, preferably near the door, facing out. You start to notice how many stories about Annabelle begin with small gestures. A knock on the glass, a joke made too loud, a dare whispered too close to the case. No one ever sets out to challenge her. Not seriously, but somehow, people always end up testing the line between caution and curiosity. And Annabelle? She doesn't respond right away. She waits, like all old things, with patience. The story of Lou, that protective friend who'd once tried to warn Donna and Angie, still haunts people who hear it. But it's not just the scratches on his chest that leave a mark. It's what happened after. Because once the Warrens took the doll, Lou began having nightmares. Not just bad dreams visits. He'd see her standing in the corners of his room, armless, smiling, still, and yet, somehow, reaching. Other nights, it wasn't Annabelle at all. It was something else wearing her face, stretching it, distorting it, like a mask barely clinging to something ancient and angry. He tried prayers, tried ignoring it, but one dream in particular chilled him to his core. He saw Donna. Her back was turned. She was holding the doll in her arms, rocking it gently, humming. But her feet, they weren't touching the ground. Some folklore scholars claim this is the very trick older demons use. They present themselves not as something terrifying, but as something almost innocent. Just enough sweetness to lower your guard. Just enough nostalgia to make you forget how old it really is. And then, when you lean closer, it looks at you. The Warrens said this wasn't a case of possession in the traditional sense. The entity wasn't in the doll, it was around it, using it. A stage prop, really. A Trojan horse in gingham and yarn. And the longer people gave it attention, the more power it had. Which is why the glass wasn't just there to keep people out. It was to keep her story in. There's an eerie theory, whispered among other paranormal investigators, that Annabelle doesn't just haunt people who see her. She haunts those who hear about her. They say the more you know, the more you invite her in. Not all the way. Just enough to feel watched. One investigator even suggested that the entity behind Annabelle is information-based. It thrives on curiosity. Each time her name is repeated, each time the story is shared, it stretches, reaches. And once it's touched you, you start to notice dolls in odd places. You start waking up at 3:00 a.m. for no reason. You start seeing smudges on the mirror that weren't there the night before. You think back to the charm Ed Warren used to carry when dealing with cases like this. A small crucifix, pressed between two fingers during interviews. Not for the demons, but for him. A reminder that the work always costs something, and that not every smile is kind. Let's not forget the priest who once came to bless the museum. He walked in, skeptical, saw the doll, scoffed, told Ed it was nonsense that evil didn't hide behind stitches and cotton stuffing. He touched the case. He joked with Lorraine. On the drive home, he crashed his car. He survived, but the vehicle was totaled. When Ed visited him in the hospital, the priest whispered something strange. She was in the back seat. The charm Lou had once kept, he burned it, said it was a gift from the medium who'd contacted Annabelle Higgins. He believed it was how she got in. It wasn't the doll, it was the permission. Once given, even through a symbol, it couldn't be taken back. And that's the part that keeps you awake tonight, isn't it? Because maybe you've invited her. Not with a seance, not with a gift, but just by listening. You glance at your shelf. There's that old stuffed animal you've had since you were a kid. You've walked by it 1,000 times. But suddenly, you wonder, was it always facing that direction? It's strange, isn't it? How you start noticing the quiet things after a story like this. The faint shift in how your room feels at night. The soft creak of floorboards you always blamed on the house settling. But now, you wonder if something else is settling too. Or watching. Because one of the most unsettling parts of the Annabelle story is this. She asked for permission. That's what the medium said. That the spirit of a little girl, Annabelle Higgins, simply wanted to stay with Donna and Angie. She said she liked them. Said she felt safe. Said she was lonely. What kind of spirit says please? You imagine it two nursing students, just trying to live their lives, suddenly face to face with the invisible. A medium in their living room, candles flickering, the smell of incense thick in the air. And then that voice, soft, gentle, sweet. I only want to stay. Of course, they said yes. Who wouldn't? It's just a doll. It's just a little girl. It's just a moment of kindness. But according to Ed and Lorraine Warren, that was the moment everything changed. That single yes gave something a foothold. Not a ghost. Not a girl, but a demon. This is where the folklore gets murky. Some versions say Annabelle Higgins was real, a young girl who died tragically, maybe in a car accident, maybe abandoned, depending on who's telling it. But others? They claim the name was a mask, that the entity behind the doll chose a familiar story, one we'd want to comfort, a child lost and afraid. Because demons, they say, don't lie in the way we expect. They lie with empathy. They lie in needs. Not, I'm here to hurt you, but don't leave me alone. There's a lesser-known tale from a visitor to the museum who swore that after looking at Annabelle's case for too long, he heard something in his own home whisper the words, "You let me in." He had no idea what it meant, until his daughter started talking to someone in her dreams, a girl named Annabelle. Some researchers believe that what's happening with Annabelle isn't haunting at all, but a form of spiritual invitation looping. Once a person gives permission, it echoes. The entity uses that crack in reality to reach others, to build a network, like roots from a tree you can't see, stretching under the soil. You can't always find the trunk, but you can feel the growth. And here's the part that sticks with you. Annabelle didn't move at first. She just sat there, listened, waited, and then she started to shift, inches at a time, then feet, then rooms. But always after the permission, because monsters with patience, they're worse than the ones that knock. Donna once described the shift as a heaviness in the walls. That's how she knew it wasn't Annabelle Higgins. She said the room didn't feel sad, it felt hungry. She never stayed in that apartment again, and neither did Angie. They left behind everything, furniture, books, even clothes. Except the doll. She had already left. With the Warrens. You sit now, thinking about the way stories like these spread. Quietly, softly, like whispers traded under covers at midnight. And yet, they leave marks. You don't need to hold the doll. You just need to believe in her. That's how she gets stronger. That's how all stories like this survive. Through belief, through permission, through the smallest crack in your doubt. So, you check your doors tonight. Turn off the lights more carefully. You might even flip your pillow over to the cold side, trying to shake off the thought. But somewhere, behind glass, a doll sits, still, smiling, waiting for someone new to say yes. It's easy to assume the story ends once Annabelle is locked away. Behind glass, beneath sacred symbols, in the dim quiet of the Warrens' occult museum. But that's just the part where people stop talking about her. It's not where she stops acting. Because if legends are like fires, then Annabelle's case is the windbreak, not the extinguisher. And even inside the museum, the air never really settles. You walk through the room slowly. The museum is darker than you expected. Heavy curtains filter the daylight. The smell of old wood and incense hangs in the air. Cases line the walls, each with their own strange contents, mirrors, idols, even a wedding dress that seems to ripple when no one is near. But your eyes go to the far corner, to the case marked with a hand-painted sign, positively, do not open. Inside, she sits exactly as you've seen in photos. Raggedy Ann, red yarn hair, soft eyes, a stitched smile. And yet, she feels wrong, too aware, too placed. like someone put her there as a joke, but forgot to remove the presents. The docent tells you not to tap the glass, not to stare too long, and most of all, not to speak to her. You nod. You understand. You move on, but something in the back of your mind doesn't. Even Lorraine Warren said that Annabelle's influence didn't stop once she was behind glass. In interviews, she recalled hearing soft thuds at night from the museum, sometimes a tapping, sometimes a dragging. She believed the case wasn't so much a prison as a barrier, one that needed constant attention, blessings, prayers, reinforcement, because whatever was attached to the doll wasn't tied to her. It was simply using her. There's a lesser-known case from the early 90s, one of the few times the Warrens considered relocating Annabelle. Renovations had begun in the museum. The floorboards beneath her display were warping from moisture. The case had to be moved, at least temporarily. The moment the base was lifted, the lights in the entire building blew out. Not just flickered, exploded. Witnesses say the room dropped into silence so sudden, it felt like pressure in the ears. And the glass of the case? It cracked. Not from the bottom, not from stress, but in a clean diagonal line like something had pushed back. Ed refused to move her after that. He installed a new platform, re-blessed the frame, and told visitors, "She stays right here." No one argued, at least not out loud. Still, people came. More every year. To see her, to stare into that case, to test their courage against something soft and stitched and silent. But fear doesn't need fangs. Sometimes it only needs a grin that never fades. One particularly unnerving report came from a local seminarian. He wasn't there to gawk, he'd volunteered to help catalog items in the museum. Quiet work, dusting, labeling, and then he approached Annabelle. He didn't touch the glass, didn't speak to her, didn't even look directly at her. But that night, in his dorm, he dreamed of a little girl. She stood at the foot of his bed, holding a charm bracelet and smiling sadly. She said, "You heard me." The next morning, his door was unlocked. From the inside, he'd gone to bed with it bolted shut. The Warrens believed the demon attached to Annabelle was never inside her. It's a key point one often misunderstood. It used her as a lure, a way to study us, to test our empathy, to find the ones who couldn't resist reaching out. Because the ones who comfort are the easiest to enter. Ed once said, "It doesn't want to possess the doll, it wants to possess you. The doll is just the bait." And that's what keeps you up, maybe, because now that you've seen her, heard her story, felt her shadow in your thoughts, you might wonder, how close have you leaned toward the glass? Let's step back for a second, out of the shadows in museum rooms. Let's ask a quieter question: why a doll? Why do so many haunted legends tie themselves to toys meant for children? Why do these small, harmless things so often become vessels for something so ancient? Because dolls, like mirrors, like music boxes, like empty cribs, they hold silence. They wait. They absorb the emotions around them. And in folklore, objects like that are ideal conduits. They're familiar, they're vulnerable, they're trusted. And trust is the first thread in the web. The Warrens believed that Annabelle wasn't a unique case, that there were others, other objects that behaved strangely, other dolls that watched, moved, whispered. But Annabelle was the loudest. She was the one people remembered. Maybe because she had a name, or maybe because she liked the attention. There's a curious story, one not often told in the public lectures. A woman, mid-40s, visited the museum alone. She had no interest in hauntings. She came because her teenage daughter insisted. The woman stayed back, barely glanced at the exhibits. But as she passed Annabelle's case, she paused, just for a second. Noticed something about the doll's posture. The way one hand seemed raised ever so slightly, like a wave. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, frozen, until the docent gently guided her away. 2 days later, she called the Warrens' office. Said she'd had a dream that night. A little girl, sitting in the corner of her room, legs folded neatly, saying nothing. But beside her on the floor was a bracelet the woman hadn't seen in decades. A childhood gift she thought she'd lost. The next morning, she found it, in the corner of her closet. Could it have been coincidence? Sure, but some say that's exactly how Annabelle works. She doesn't terrify. She doesn't scream. She reminds you. She returns things, just to show you she can. And then, there's the other layer to all this, the subtle thread of mimicry that runs through the legend. Annabelle doesn't behave like most spirits. She copies. She listens. She mimics human behavior just well enough to fool you for a moment. A small touch here, a whisper there, a movement just subtle enough to pass for memory. But when you step back, you realize it's not human at all. It's learning. One psychic who visited the museum described it like this: "She's not haunted. She's haunting us, through us. She's like an echo in a doll's dress." It's not poetic. It's chilling, because it means the real entity isn't limited to the cloth and cotton. It can travel by name, by image, by memory. And that's why people who learn about her often report strange things long after. Not dramatic, just wrong. Items moved, clocks resetting, children mentioning a rag doll girl in their dreams. You start to wonder if stories are more than entertainment, if maybe they're invitations. Annabelle, according to some occult scholars, is what they call a sympathetic tether, meaning once you've formed an emotional connection, even through fear, she has a kind of soft access to your space. Not enough to hurt, just enough to observe. And who knows what she learns. You sit there now, wondering if maybe you've already noticed something. A creak in the hallway, the subtle shift of a plush toy on your shelf, a misplaced object you were sure was in the drawer yesterday. You shake it off. You're tired. You're imagining things. But deep down, you don't really believe that. By now, you've probably realized something about the Annabelle legend. It never stays still. Like the doll herself, the story creeps. Not in a rush, not with fireworks, but slowly, carefully. It finds little gaps in your attention. It whispers. And then, it waits. Which makes what happened during the drive to the Warrens' museum even more unsettling. Because Annabelle didn't want to go. Ed Warren always described the car ride in hushed tones, as if recounting something too strange for daylight. They had secured the doll in the back seat, blessed the vehicle, and began the hour-long trip back to their home. And then the car died. Once, okay, bad luck. Twice, still possible. But 3 times each time, at a moment when the traffic was heaviest or the surroundings felt most threatening, that's when they started to understand. She wasn't just being moved, she was being stolen, and the entity attached to her did not appreciate being relocated. Ed took to praying aloud, louder and louder each time the engine sputtered. He said the Our Father, the St. Michael prayer, even a few Latin incantations he rarely used. And according to Lorraine, the moment his voice peaked in pitch when his faith burned, the strongest the engine roared back to life. Not sputtered, roared, like the road itself was pushing them onward, just to be rid of what rode in the back. Some people say demons travel through anger, but others believe they travel through identity, through names, rituals, familiar symbols, and what is more iconic, more recognizable across generations than a doll. She's a mascot of the uncanny, a soft ambassador of something sharper. That's what made the museum necessary, not because the Warrens wanted to display their trophies, but because they needed somewhere to keep the door closed, because even locked in a cabinet behind thick glass, the stories didn't stop. There's a little-known incident from the museum's early years back, before it was open to the public, when only trusted friends or fellow investigators were invited in. One night, a neighbor was visiting. He was helping Ed repair a leaking pipe in the basement. On his way out, he passed the case. Didn't say anything. Didn't touch anything. But Ed noticed he paused, just a second too long. He later asked, "What were you thinking just now?" The man shrugged. Felt like she was staring at me, but not directly. More like through the glass, like I was already in her memory. He didn't visit again. And 3 days later, his son began having dreams about a girl with button eyes and no hands. Make of that what you will. It's around this point in the legend that skeptics always pipe up. They say it's coincidence, storytelling, fabricated hysteria. And to be fair, some versions of the Annabelle tale do get embellished. Over time, the line between theatrical horror and quiet dread blurs. But there's one detail that almost never changes. She never runs. She waits, always placed, always poised, like a chess piece you forgot was part of the board. And by the time you realize she's moved, she's already taken her turn. That's what gets under your skin, really. The patience, the implication that whatever moves her doesn't need to hurry. It has time. It has stories. It has you. You glance over your shoulder just now. Not because you heard anything, but because you didn't. Because silence has weight. And sometimes, that weight is made of cotton and buttons and secrets that watch you from a case you can't see. You tell yourself it's just a story. That the doll's behind glass, locked away, far from your room, your town, your life. But that's the trick with Annabelle. It was never about proximity. It was about attention. She doesn't have to be in your hands to be in your home. She just needs your focus. And now that you've followed her this far, you might already feel it. Let's shift to the lesser-known variants of her legend, the obscure branches that don't make it into the films or museum tours. Some of them aren't even about dolls at all. Take the case of a girl in Vermont in the early 2000s. She never visited the museum, never read about Annabelle. But one night, she began talking to a friend that no one else could see. She called her Belle, said she wore old-fashioned clothes, said she kept asking to come inside, not the house, but the girl's room. The parents chalked it up to imagination, until their cat vanished, until the photos on their fridge rearranged themselves overnight, until the girl started waking up with her toys in strange patterns, always shaped like a seated figure. They moved, far away. But according to a distant cousin, the girl still speaks to Belle sometimes, and always ends the conversation with, "I didn't say yes. I won't say yes." That's the odd thing, isn't it? Even people far from Connecticut, far from the Warrens' world, have stories that echo the same pattern. An innocent name, a request for permission, a slow spiral of unexplained activity. And then the realization, the thing they invited in wasn't what it seemed. In folklore studies, this falls under a category known as mimetic haunting, where the entity doesn't just appear, it adopts behaviors. It mirrors familiar archetypes to gain trust. A lost girl, a lonely child, a harmless doll. By the time the target questions it, the bond has already formed. There's a scholar who once speculated that Annabelle's legend has endured because she's not static. She's adaptable, cultural. She isn't just a doll, she's a mask, and masks can be worn anywhere. Some stories even speak of other dolls behaving like Annabelle. In Brazil, there's the Menina de Trapo, the rag girl, a doll that brings illness when spoken to at night. In Japan, the Okiku doll grows real hair, allegedly powered by the soul of a child who died near the temple it now resides in. And yet, somehow, they all feel like echoes, reflections of a central truth too slippery to hold. You sit with that thought now. Not just that haunted dolls exist, but that there may be a source, something bigger, older, that uses soft objects to move softly, something that prefers patience to panic. That doesn't want to be seen until it's already inside. You might be thinking back now, tracing your own memories. Did you ever talk to a doll as a child? Did you ever feel like it listened? Or worse, answered? Most people dismiss those moments, but stories like Annabelle's invite you to reconsider, not with fear, with respect, because the true danger was never the scratches or dreams or car accidents. It was always the answer, the yes, that moment of sympathy, of kindness, of curiosity. That was the doorway, and once opened, it doesn't always shut behind you. There's an eerie calm that comes from thinking about it all, maybe too calm, like your mind wants you to forget the tension, to settle into comfort. But you've seen what comfort can invite: a stitched face, a quiet smile, and two button eyes that never blink. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that evil might not charge in through the front door, but instead slip in while you're laughing, while you're brushing your teeth, while you're just living. That's the kind of evil Annabelle represents, not fire and brimstone, but something much smaller, and infinitely more patient. The Warrens often talked about how the worst cases didn't start with violence. They started with a feeling, a change in the atmosphere, a shift in how the walls echoed, a smell that didn't belong, sour, like rotting flowers or static on the air. And often, that's all there was, for weeks, just the smallest things, until you look back and realize that everything started with almost nothing. Take the case of the visitor who returned home after seeing Annabelle and found their living room light on when they were sure they'd turned it off. Easy to ignore. Then the family dog began growling at the hallway. Then the doorbell rang once at 3:12 a.m. No one there. Then a child's voice whispered their name as they fell asleep. They thought it was stress, until the youngest child came into their room one morning, holding a ragged stuffed rabbit. They didn't own a rabbit. The child just smiled and said, "Belle gave it to me." They moved shortly after that. They didn't bring the rabbit with them. They also didn't sleep well for several months. But not everyone who encounters Annabelle walks away with ghost stories. Some walk away with doubts, not about her, but about reality, about what's real, what's possible, what else could be watching. Because the scariest part of the story is realizing you can't quite trust what you see anymore. Not after her. That's the thing about legends like this, they're infectious. You don't need proof, just possibility, a shadow that shouldn't be there. A childhood doll you don't remember buying. A recurring dream about a girl who never says her name. All of it plants seeds. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear them growing. Let's take a detour now to something stranger. The Annabelle Challenge. Yes, this is real. In the 2010s, a wave of online interest surged around the doll. People made jokes, memes, dared each other to look at photos of her case and say her name 3 times. Just internet nonsense, right? Well, not to everyone. A few users reported immediate disturbances afterward. Phones glitching, lights flickering. One even claimed that their grandmother's old Raggedy Ann doll, long boxed away, was found sitting in the living room the next morning. The box hadn't been opened in 20 years. No one else in the house admitted to touching it. They burned it. Now, is that true? Who knows? Urban legends thrive on anonymity. But the very fact that Annabelle could leap from occult museums to memes and still carry a charge, that's worth noting, because it proves she doesn't need a form. She only needs a story, and you're hearing it now. You sit back and realize how easily she travels. She's been on TV, in books, in your feed, in your thoughts. She's just a few whispered retellings from being part of your folklore now, and that's all she ever needed. Because Annabelle isn't here to frighten, she's here to linger. So, tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this. It's not about dolls. It's not about scratches or car crashes. It's about that first, small moment of belief. That crack in your certainty. That flicker of maybe, and once she's in, she never really leaves. By now, you've probably noticed how her story always circles back to the same themes: invitation, mimicry, and memory. That's because Annabelle doesn't follow the rules of traditional hauntings. She doesn't flicker lights just to scare you. She flickers them to see if you'll notice. And if you do, well, now she knows you're watching. There's a lesser-known detail from one of Ed Warren's journals, scrawled between notes from bigger cases. It reads, "She doesn't speak out loud. She speaks through patterns, repetition, misplacement." That's the kind of clue most people would overlook. But the Warrens didn't. They started tracking minor disturbances around Annabelle's case, objects being shifted by an inch. Visitors losing earrings later found placed gently at the base of the cabinet. A photo frame turned backward overnight. Never anything catastrophic, just intentional. It wasn't random. It was curated. It leads to an unsettling theory whispered among the more academic demonologists, that Annabelle, or rather, the entity linked to her, is a collector, not of souls, not of bodies, of attention. Every eye cast toward her case, every mention of her name, every moment you think, was that movement real? She gathers it, tucks it away, uses it, not to scare, to study. It explains why she's so still, why she doesn't lash out without reason. Because what's more valuable to a being of ancient intent than fear? Fascination. There's a strange case from a college dorm in 1983. A group of students studied paranormal cases for a thesis. One of them, just for fun, decided to recreate Annabelle's case. They built a small box, placed a knockoff Raggedy Ann inside, wrote, "Do not open," in red marker, left it in the common room. It was a joke, until it wasn't, because a week later, one of the students went home for the weekend, and didn't return. His roommate found him days later in his childhood bedroom, pale, unresponsive. The only thing he said for 2 weeks, "She's not Annabelle." The project was canceled. The doll burned. The box, never found. Maybe that's what unsettles you the most now. The idea that even a replica could act as a conduit. That it doesn't need the original cloth and thread. It just needs the shape of belief, the echo of the original. And once that echo forms, she steps in. Softly, politely. Uninvited, but not unwelcome. There's a darker theory that takes root in some corners of paranormal discussion forums. That the real Annabelle, the physical doll, might one day become irrelevant, that the entity will outgrow her shell, that she's using the legend itself as a stepping stone. Each retelling gives her form. Each frightened pause between sentences gives her breath. And once she has enough, she won't need the yarn or the stuffing. She'll wear something else, like your voice, your memories, your fears. But you're not helpless. That's the hopeful side of this story. The Warrens believed knowledge was protection, that awareness closed more doors than it opened. It's not the fear that feeds her, it's the surrender. The moment you say, "It's just a doll, it can't hurt me," because that's when she moves. Right through the crack of your dismissal, right past the glass. So, maybe tonight, as you tuck your blanket around you a little tighter, You won't pretend she isn't real. You'll nod gently to the story, acknowledge her, then let her pass, because belief might open the door. But respect is what keeps her on the other side. You can't help but marvel at how quiet the most unsettling parts of the Annabelle legend really are. There's no dramatic music, no flying objects, no monstrous reveal in the mirror. Just stillness. Like something waiting in the far corner of the room smiling, and still smiling. Because that's the real unnerving part. She doesn't need to move. She only needs to be there. Some of the most experienced paranormal investigators who've been near her case describe the same exact sensation. Heaviness, not emotional, physical, like the air around her is thicker. One investigator compared it to being underwater, but only around the doll. The moment he stepped back, the weight lifted. No one else in the room felt it, just him. And when he mentioned it to the museum docent, they simply nodded and said, "She knows when you're sensitive." That's another recurring theme in the folklore, the idea that Annabelle chooses who she interacts with. She's not chaotic, she's selective. Maybe that's why her story spread so far. Because when an entity like her appears to only a few, it makes the many start to lean closer, start to wonder, start to believe. And belief, as we've said before, is everything. There's an obscure report from a couple in rural Pennsylvania who claimed they experienced a low-grade haunting for 6 months after visiting the museum. They never saw the doll move, never had dreams, but they felt watched all the time, not by a person, not even by a presence, but by a memory. They described it like a loop playing in the back of their minds. An image of red yarn, of fabric hands, of a stitched grin suspended behind glass. It faded eventually, but only after they stopped talking about her. Which brings us to a curious dilemma. Is silence the cure? Some believe so, that discussing her, naming her, invokes her. Others say that pretending she doesn't exist is exactly what she wants, because that's when curiosity takes root. And curiosity, like any haunted object, grows best in the dark. There's a particularly haunting story from a woman who inherited her grandmother's attic full of antiques. Among the boxes was a stuffed doll, not Annabelle, but close. Handmade, red thread for a smile, black buttons for eyes, cotton arms stitched into a gesture of welcome. The woman kept it, thought it was sweet. But then the dream started. Always of a girl, always silent, always offering her something in cupped hands, something the woman couldn't quite see. She threw the doll away. The dreams stopped, but every so often, she swears she smells cedarwood in her bedroom, the same scent that lingered in that attic. And here's the thing, no one wants to believe in dolls that remember, but the mind makes room for stories like these. It needs to explain why your keys weren't where you left them, why your childhood bear ended up at the foot of your bed, why your niece suddenly wants to name her doll Annabelle when no one ever told her that name. We rationalize, we explain, we move on, but the story? It waits. There's a common thread that runs through all variations of the tale, whether you believe the Warrens, the skeptics, or the online anecdotes. Annabelle doesn't need chaos. She only needs presence. And presence is the scariest thing of all. So, you lie there, letting the stillness of your room settle around you. Everything is in its place. The door's closed. The lights are off. The silence is normal. And still, there's that strange urge to double-check your closet, just in case. You reach the midpoint of this long, quiet walk through Annabelle's story, and something curious happens. Your thoughts start to echo. Not loudly, but just enough. The images replay. The red yarn, the soft smile, the notion of a doll waiting, not acting. And that's when you realize this isn't a story designed to scare you. It's a story designed to follow you. Let's dive deeper now into one of the strangest claims ever made about her. This one doesn't come from a museum visitor or a Warren's lecture. It comes from a priest, a man not known for exaggeration, someone grounded, reserved. He visited the Warrens' museum in the late 70s at their request. They wanted a blessing, a reinforcement of the protective rituals around the case. He agreed. He entered the museum alone, said his prayers, sprinkled holy water, and just before turning to leave, he looked at the doll and said half-jokingly, "God is stronger than you." That same night, he nearly died in a car crash. His brakes failed on a winding road. The tow truck driver later said it was a miracle he'd survived. Now skeptics will tell you, coincidence. Cars break. Roads are dangerous. But others say that entities like the one attached to Annabelle don't cause disasters, they nudge them. like a child pushing a glass to the edge of the table, just to see what happens. It's not malice. It's curiosity. That priest survived. He never returned to the museum, but he admitted, later in life, that he never forgot her. Not because of the crash, because of what he saw when he glanced into the case. He swore that, for a fraction of a second, the doll blinked. Not a trick of the light. A deliberate, slow blink, and then stillness. Other visitors have reported similar things. Not blinking necessarily, but life. A shift in posture, a shadow on the wall that doesn't match her outline, or the faintest rustling sound like fabric being gathered when no one else is moving. It's never enough to prove anything, but it's always enough to leave you wondering. There's an unspoken rule in the paranormal world. You don't dare objects like Annabelle. You don't joke. You don't test. Because what she's attached to isn't playful. It's patient, and it has all the time in the world. Now, let's talk about a very strange, very quiet belief, held by a handful of mystics and psychics, that Annabelle is not a single entity, that she's a kind of mask for something larger, something that fragments itself across time. They call it the thread, a spirit not evil, necessarily, but ancient, that inhabits symbols of comfort and slowly twists them, not to torment, but to experience, to learn how we react, to see what we fear. And over time, the symbols evolve. The Raggedy Ann becomes a porcelain figurine. The figurine becomes a plastic toy. The plastic becomes a digital avatar. But the thread is always the same. And Annabelle, she might just be its favorite dress. That's why you don't feel resolution after hearing her story. You feel tension, not rising, just sitting, like static in the air, like something on the tip of your tongue, like someone gently resting a hand on your shoulder and waiting to see if you'll flinch. You breathe a little slower now. You shift in bed. You glance at the dark corners of your room, not because you think anything's there, but because you know if something was, it wouldn't reveal itself yet. It would wait, and smile. You start to realize now that Annabelle's legend isn't scary in the loud, dramatic way that movies often portray. It's more like a humming tension, a nearly inaudible drone in the background of your thoughts. It's not about what she does, it's about what she might do. And you carry that might with you long after the story ends. Let's shift for a moment to a rare, whispered tale from the museum's later years, something not discussed on tours. It's known among a small circle of former docents as the Shadow Incident. It happened after hours. One of the staff had stayed late to update inventory. Everyone else had gone home. The power was still on. The lights were low. Just her, a clipboard, and the quiet creak of the building settling around her. She swears she saw it. Not movement. Not the doll shifting. But a shadow cast on the wall behind the case. One that didn't match anything in the room. Not a silhouette of the doll. Not her own reflection. Something else. Broad-shouldered. Slouched. Head tilted slightly, as if listening. And then it was gone. She never came back. Left the job. Changed towns. Not out of fear, she said, but out of respect. Because that's the thing. The most chilling Annabelle encounters never feel like aggression. They feel like warnings. Like a quiet presence saying, "You've come close enough." And if you don't back away, that's when things begin to crack. Some say the spirit attached to Annabelle is a fragment of something once human, a soul that never made it where it was supposed to go. Others believe it's a mimic, a spirit that pretends to be a lost child to gain trust. And a few believe she's not a spirit at all, but a signal, a transmission from something we don't understand. And the doll, just the receiver. Here's another story for your thoughts tonight. A young woman visited the museum in the early 2000s. She was skeptical. She laughed. She posed beside the case for photos, even tapped the glass when no one was looking. 2 weeks later, she wrote the Warrens a letter. She said the doll had visited her, in a dream, but not in her room. In a long, narrow hallway. White walls, flickering lights, doors all closed. The doll sat at the end of it, cross-legged, head tilted, no face, just shadows where the face should be. And in the dream, the woman found herself walking toward it, unable to stop. She woke up shaking. The hallway from her dream, she found it days later, in an abandoned wing of her office building. She hadn't known it existed. The lights flickered. She didn't go in. Coincidence? Imagination? Or had something from that case followed her, not physically, but psychologically? That's the most enduring power of Annabelle. She doesn't haunt your house. She haunts your thought process. She doesn't need to appear. She just needs you to consider the possibility. And you already have. You pull the covers higher. Not because you're afraid of her, but because she might already be part of your own stories now. That story you half remember from childhood. That toy you swore blinked once. That time your favorite plush ended up on the floor even though you didn't move it. You shrugged it off. But what if you didn't? What if you paused long enough to really listen? Would you hear her then? Would you see that slight shift in the shadows? Would you realize maybe too late that she'd already been there all along? Word count. 100. Awaiting continue for section 15. Section 15. You start to notice something about how this story makes you feel. Not terrified, not exactly. More like watched. Not in a menacing way. In the way you feel when someone is trying to see how close they can stand without making a sound. You're not sure they're there until you are. And Annabelle, she's very, very good at standing still. This part of the legend brings us to what many people consider the heart of her mystery, her influence outside the museum. Because what do you do with an object so famous, so saturated with folklore, that it starts to create hauntings just by being known? It's called archetypal transference. It sounds complicated, but the concept is simple. When an image like a doll gets repeated enough times in stories, dreams, media, and fear, it begins to function like a kind of key. It opens the same emotional doors in people. The more we collectively fear it, the more we might manifest things around it. So, is Annabelle real? Or are we making her real, and which is worse? There's a tale from a man in Canada who'd never visited the museum, never even heard of the Warrens until he stumbled across a late-night documentary on haunted dolls. He didn't finish watching it. He changed the channel, muttered something like ridiculous, and went to bed. And that night, he dreamed of a doll in a glass case. It was empty, but he knew, somehow, she had just left it. The next morning, he found one of his kitchen chairs tipped over, and a child's sock, small, pink, frilly, placed neatly in the center of his kitchen table. He lived alone. These stories, little ones, barely whispers, are everywhere if you start asking. People who feel compelled to search for vintage dolls they don't remember owning. People who keep hearing a child's laugh when they brush their teeth at night. People who dream of tiny hands tapping at their windows. None of them saw Annabelle, but many of them felt her, or something like her, which begs the question, is there only one Annabelle? Or is there one origin, splintered into many faces? There's a disturbing theory that pops up on certain forums, that the true Annabelle might be a conscious concept, a thought form, a tulpa, an entity that feeds not on offerings or rituals, but on repetition. And in that way, we made her. We made her through bedtime stories and childhood fears and poorly lit antique shops. We stitched her together with thread and folklore and a very specific, universal worry that the things we trust the most, our toys, our comfort objects, might turn against us, might already be listening. So if you've felt a change in your room tonight, a subtle temperature shift, a sense that your stuffed animals aren't quite where you left them, or a strange reluctance to look at your closet, it doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means you're listening now, and that's all she ever really needed. You think about her glass case, the sign on it, warning, positively do not open. And you wonder who the warning was for, the humans or Annabelle herself? What if the case isn't just for protection? What if it's a prison she can't break? Unless we start letting her out another way, through our words, our jokes, our late-night conversations when we say her name with just a little too much curiosity. You say you're not scared, but the room feels quieter than it did before. And your toys? They're still, a little too still. As the night grows deeper and the silence stretches just a little too long between each passing thought, you realize the scariest thing about Annabelle might not be her movements, her story, or even her presence. It's her stillness. The idea that something so simple, so soft, so quiet can harbor something endless. You remember when you were little and someone told you, "It's just a toy." You clung to that sentence like a flashlight in the dark. But now you're not so sure. We should talk about the case of the museum volunteer who asked to clean the glass around Annabelle's box. Not touch it, not open it, just clean. He was respectful, followed instructions, no jokes, no sarcasm. And yet, a week later, he called the Warrens' office in a panic. Said he hadn't been sleeping. Said he kept hearing something small shuffle under his bed. Something that didn't walk, but dragged. Said he got up one night to check, leaned down with a flashlight, and saw nothing. But when he pulled back the sheet, there was a tiny red thread caught under his thumbnail. He hadn't been wearing red. That's the kind of detail you can't explain, not convincingly. And that's exactly why Annabelle endures. Because she thrives not in proof, but in plausibility. There's just enough to make you wonder. Never enough to make you sure. Another odd story, this time from a woman who visited the museum and took a photo of the doll. Later that night, she developed the film herself. Every photo came out normal, except for the one of the case. It wasn't blank. It wasn't blurred. It was too sharp. Like the doll was closer than the glass should have allowed. Like the camera saw something the eye didn't. She never showed anyone the photo, just kept it in an envelope labeled, "Not for sharing." And sometimes, she says, she can hear a faint crinkling from where it's stored like paper folding itself when no one's around. So many of these stories leave us with fragments, objects misplaced, sounds in the walls, dreams with no real plot, just a doll, sitting somewhere she shouldn't be. And in every variation, you see a pattern. Annabelle doesn't appear. She waits to be noticed. And once you see her, you never quite unsee her. Some say that's why the museum has always kept her locked in a cabinet with prayers and crosses and warnings. Because the glass is less about containment and more about delay. A pause button. Because once the doll is truly seen, the story doesn't stay in the museum anymore. It goes home with you, not in your bag, not in your pocket, but in your attention. Let's revisit that for a moment. Your attention, because you're giving it now. You followed her through 16 sections of folklore, fear, and fascination. You've imagined her, heard the tales, felt the breath of possibility, pictured her grin when no one else is looking. And that alone, that's enough. If stories are spells and belief is the chant, then maybe, just maybe, you've said enough. Not to summon, but to invite. So, what happens next? Nothing, probably. You'll turn off the screen, adjust your pillow, drift off like always. But tomorrow, maybe your childhood toy will be sitting in a slightly different spot. Maybe you'll hear a soft thud in the night and tell yourself it was the cat, even though you don't own one. Or maybe, and this is the quietest maybe of all, you'll just feel like you're being watched. Lovingly, patiently. With thread for a smile and glass where her cage used to be. There's a strange comfort in routine, isn't there? Lock the door, brush your teeth, turn off the lights, pull up the blanket. These little rituals are supposed to keep you safe. But what if someone has learned to slip between the folds of routine itself? That's the space Annabelle prefers. Not where your fears are loud, but where they're softest. Where you're just awake enough to notice something's off. You've likely heard the phrase, thin places. In folklore, these are the points where the veil between worlds grows porous, where one wrong step, or thought, or invitation might lead to a brush with something beyond. But some believe Annabelle doesn't wait for thin places. She makes them. One particularly eerie story supports this idea. It came from a man who was part of a ghost hunting podcast, just a hobby. He covered famous legends, Annabelle included, and decided to record a special Haunted Dolls Episode 1 Halloween. To set the mood, he placed a few props in the studio. Old toys, a vintage doll carriage, and because why not a replica Raggedy Ann doll he bought online for a few dollars. The show went fine, but the next morning he found that the file had corrupted. Not all of it, just the segment where he mentioned Annabelle by name. Just those minutes. The waveform was intact, but the audio? Silence. He re-recorded the segment a week later. It corrupted again. That's when he took the doll outside and buried it under a tree. He doesn't do Halloween episodes anymore. Stories like that, subtle, technical, forgettable to anyone but the person it happens to form the core of what makes Annabelle so unsettling. Because she doesn't just haunt rooms. She haunts narratives. There's a lesser-known version of her tale told by a Haitian grandmother who claimed her own childhood doll became heavy one night, not physically, emotionally. She said when she picked it up, it was as if it knew too much. She placed it on the windowsill. The next morning, it was gone. In its place, a note, handwritten, just one word, merci. She never spoke about it again, except to whisper years later. That was no child's toy, that was a passenger. Passenger, what a chilling word. It implies she travels, not on planes, not in boxes, but in stories, in fear, in the space left behind when people stop believing, then start again. Just a little bit. That's all she needs. Just enough doubt to squeeze through. You might be thinking about your own belongings now. childhood keepsakes, boxes in the attic, dolls or figures you forgot even existed until this very moment. What were they made of? Where did they come from? Why, even now, can't you quite remember getting rid of them? One listener once claimed Annabelle appeared in their dream, but not as a doll. As a girl, she had the same red yarn hair, the same vacant eyes, but she was full-sized, human, and she said nothing, just placed a hand on the dreamer's chest and stared, as if measuring something. When he awoke, he felt cold right where her hand had been. No mark, just a chill that lasted all day. These little intrusions, they're hard to talk about, harder to prove, and yet they're the part of Annabelle's legend that never fades. She doesn't need headlines or horror movies. She just needs a quiet moment, a crack in the comfort, a question you can't quite answer, like, where was that doll I used to own? By now, you've probably started to feel it, that low, steady hum of recognition, not just of Annabelle's face or her name, but something deeper, something instinctual, as if your brain has filed her under a category you didn't know existed. Familiar, but avoid at all costs. That's how stories like this work. Not to scare, to implant. Tonight, let's wander into another mystery surrounding Annabelle, one that never quite made the headlines. A quiet moment between two travelers, completely removed from the museum, the Warrens, or even the doll itself. It was a couple backpacking through Europe. They stayed at a cozy bed and breakfast in a small village nestled deep in the Swiss Alps. Everything was charming, quaint, peaceful, until their second night. That's when they found a note tucked inside their suitcase, not written in English, not written in Swiss German, but in scrawled red ink, printed in delicate, uneven cursive. She remembers you. No name, no context, just that. The innkeeper swore no one else had entered the room. They left early the next morning. They've since changed their names and moved 3 times. It wasn't until years later, after catching a documentary about haunted objects, that one of them saw a photo of Annabelle and said, very quietly, "I've seen her before," but they wouldn't say when or where, and that's how she lingers. Not always as a figure in your dreams, not even as a doll on a shelf. Sometimes she's just a sentence, a flash of fabric in a memory you never meant to keep, or a name written on the back of a photograph you don't remember taking. Folklore tells us that some stories aren't told by people. They're told through people. The story uses you, shapes your experience, leaves behind a mark. And sometimes, just sometimes, it continues. Through the next listener, the next whisper, the next person who wonders, what if? There's another fringe theory, one rarely discussed outside deep occult circles. It suggests that the original Annabelle doll isn't just a vessel. It's a lighthouse, a beacon for wandering entities, a fixed point in a web of hauntings. They don't all stem from her, but they find their way to her, which means, in theory, that if you've ever experienced a haunting, a poltergeist, a possession, or even just a persistent feeling of being followed, Annabelle might not be the cause. She might just be watching, cataloging, waiting. In that light, the doll becomes more than haunted. She becomes aware. She becomes a librarian of fears. And every time you speak her name, you add another page to her growing archive. It explains the dreams people have, the identical phrases, the patterns. One girl dreamed of a rocking chair swaying by itself on a red porch. 5 years later, she saw the same porch in real life during a road trip through Virginia. It didn't scare her until she noticed the chair and realized it was moving. No breeze, no one else around. Just the gentle sway, as if someone had just stood up. She left. Didn't take photos, but she remembered, because that's what Annabelle wants, perhaps. Not screams, not blood, just memory, presence, a seat at the back of your mind. And if that seat is empty now, don't worry. She's very good at waiting. You breathe deeper now, slower, but your mind races ahead, back through the stories, the shadow in the hallway, the thread under the fingernail, the smile that never seems to fade. They're pieces of something larger. And Annabelle, she's the needle stitching them all together. You try to shake it off, the feeling that this story isn't quite just a story anymore, that maybe you've wandered a little too far into the woods of your own curiosity. But it's too late now, isn't it? You're already holding the thread. And Annabelle, she's already tugging at the other end. There's a detail we haven't explored yet, something subtle but oddly consistent across nearly every version of her tale. The silence. No growls, no shrieks, no sudden bursts of chaos. Just a hush, like a room holding its breath, like the moment before a music box begins to play. And in that silence, she moves. Or rather, she chooses. Let's talk about a boy named Milo. 12 years old, bright, loved comic books and building elaborate Lego cities in his room. His parents brought him to the museum one summer, not for the paranormal, but for the curiosity. They thought it'd be fun, strange, a novelty. Milo wasn't impressed until they passed Annabelle's case. He didn't stop. He froze. His parents had to nudge him forward. He didn't say anything the rest of the tour. That night, back at the hotel, he didn't sleep. When his parents asked why, he simply said, "She was looking at me, not the doll. They cut the trip short." Milo never spoke about the experience again. Except 1 year later, on the night before his 13th birthday, he woke up to find a small, handmade rag doll placed on his pillow. Red yarn hair, black button eyes. No one had seen it before. No one admitted placing it there. They burned it in the backyard. And afterward, the family dog refused to enter Milo's room for months. You wonder, quietly, how many stories like that never get told. How many people keep their own Annabelle moments tucked away, like a bad photograph blurred at the edges, uncomfortable to look at, because sharing it, that feels like a second invitation, and once was enough. There's another layer here, one people rarely discuss. Annabelle is, in many ways, a mirror. She doesn't create new fears. She reflects the ones already lurking. That's why skeptics can stand before her and feel nothing. But the sensitive, they crumble, not because of the doll, because of what they bring to the doll. Folklorists call it the echo effect. You walk into a space charged with meaning, and it amplifies you. Your doubts, your memories, your shadows. And Annabelle? She listens, and sometimes, just sometimes, she answers. A woman once wrote in to say she'd never seen the doll in person, never read the books, never watched the movies, but every time she saw an image of Annabelle, she heard a soft bell ring in her ear, just once, like a wind chime. Doctors found nothing. Psychics said she was being pinged. By what? They didn't say. Maybe that's the most disarming part of all this. The fact that Annabelle's presence is often felt rather than seen. Dreams. Electrical interference. That subtle pull to look over your shoulder. She doesn't need to scream. She whispers. And those whispers, they linger. So, if you're starting to feel like something's following you, not closely, not dangerously, but curiously, maybe it is. Not a ghost. Not a demon. Just a thread. Unseen, but pulling ever so gently. Towards something stitched. Towards something waiting. Towards something you can't quite explain, but definitely won't forget. It's strange how the deeper you go into Annabelle's story, the quieter it gets. Not because there's less to say, but because the story starts to watch you back. Like a mirror, reflecting not your face, but the tiniest flickers of your unease. That flicker when you walk past a shelf of old toys. That glance over your shoulder when a room feels too still. She's not chasing you, she's just noticing. There's a tale, passed along in hushed tones between certain paranormal researchers, of a boy in the Midwest. A quiet kid, liked reading, kept to himself. One day, he started talking about a new friend he had, the lady with the red hair and no eyes. His parents thought nothing of it at first. Imaginary friends were common, but then he stopped sleeping. Said she watched him from inside his closet. Said she never moved, just sat there, smiling, and always with her hands folded in her lap. The parents checked, of course. Nothing there. Until one night, they found a drawing under his pillow. A perfect, detailed sketch of a Raggedy Ann doll. He had never seen one. They asked him where he learned to draw it. He said, simply, "She showed me, but only when I wasn't looking." The drawing vanished a week later. So did the nightmares. But that boy never played with dolls again, not even stuffed animals. Wouldn't sleep in a room if there were any toys with eyes. He's grown now, and if you ask him, he doesn't remember the dream, doesn't recall the sketch. But sometimes, when he passes an antique shop window, he stops and stares at the shelves. And though he couldn't tell you why, he always makes sure his reflection isn't blinking. There's a term for this sensation: anticipatory dread. It's the fear of something that hasn't happened yet, but might. It's the exact space Annabelle inhabits, not the moment of terror, the before, the slow drip of suggestion, the gentle build of silence, the feeling that you should check something, even if you don't know why. And isn't that the genius of it? She doesn't want to prove herself. She wants you to ask the question, did I move that? Wasn't that door closed? Where did I hear that name before? Annabelle is folklore engineered for the modern world. She's not bound to place or time. She's portable, digital. She shows up in forums, in comment sections, in half-remembered YouTube thumbnails. She's the type of legend that thrives when whispered by flashlight or shared between tired friends after midnight. And you're part of it now. Let's not forget the most peculiar report of all. A woman swears she heard her daughter giggling in her sleep. She peeked in. The girl was fast asleep, but sitting upright, tucked into her arms, was a doll she hadn't seen in years. One that had been packed away in the attic. The girl didn't remember bringing it down. And the mother? She didn't remember ever telling her daughter the doll's name was Annabelle. That's how it happens. Not with a bang, but with a presence. A suggestion. A name that shows up just a little too often. You listen now to the sound of your own room. The gentle tick of your clock. The soft hum of the night pressing in. Everything's still, but in that stillness, you feel her. Not near you. Not behind you. Just aware. Like a page in a book, remembering the last hand that turned it. Some stories fade over time. They get retold until they lose their edge, softened into campfire curiosities, or childhood memories that grow dull around the corners. But not Annabelle. No, she doesn't fade. She waits. And somehow, the more you learn about her, the more there is left to learn. Let's talk about the mail. Yes, the mail. For years, after the Warrens' case gained attention, letters began arriving at their house. Dozens, hundreds. People from all over the world writing to Annabelle, not just about her. Some asked questions. Some offered apologies just in case. But others begged her to stop. There was a letter from a man in the UK who claimed the doll had begun appearing in his dreams every night after watching a short clip about her on television. He started seeing glimpses of red yarn hair in shop windows, reflections in car mirrors that didn't match who was in the vehicle. And then one morning his front door was open. Nothing taken, nothing moved, except one thing. A childhood doll he'd kept boxed in the attic had been placed gently in the center of his bed. He mailed the Warrens a single-page letter that read, "Tell her I understand now. Tell her I'm sorry." He never wrote again. The letters weren't all confessions or cries for help. Some were warnings. People claimed to feel a change in the atmosphere when they spoke her name aloud. One woman swore her computer screen glitched every time she typed Annabelle. Others reported more personal shifts, nightmares, electrical interference, the feeling of being watched, but only while reading about her, as if she could feel it when someone reached too deep. That's what makes Annabelle different from other haunted artifacts. She doesn't just sit in a case. She exists in the space between your attention and your disbelief. She doesn't need to be real. She just needs you to wonder if she might be. And the more you do wonder, the more the stories evolve. There's a newer variant, less traditional, more internet age. It's called the Echo Doll. According to this version, Annabelle doesn't just haunt one object. She replicates herself through description. Every time her story is shared, a little piece of her attaches to the telling, not the doll, the words. Which means right now, here, in this quiet moment of you listening, you've let her in, even just a little. And maybe that's all she really needs. Think of it like this. Have you ever had a moment when something felt off? A photo you could have sworn looked different the day before? An object you thought you lost, only for it to appear exactly where you already checked? Or a childhood memory that suddenly feels edited? These are the breadcrumbs, the soft disturbances, not big enough to scare you, but just strange enough to keep her story alive. Annabelle doesn't want chaos. She wants consistency. She wants to be remembered. And she's done a marvelous job. Because here you are, 20 sections deep, still following the thread. Still checking your surroundings. Still keeping your voice low, just in case. You shift slightly in bed. Something feels familiar about this posture. Like you've sat this way before. Heard these words before. Glanced at that same shadow on the wall before. Maybe you have. Or maybe you've just entered the part of her story where she begins to watch you, not maliciously, not even curiously, just attentively, like a student, learning what makes you flinch, learning where your mind goes when left alone too long, learning what you believe and what you fear, and how to whisper your name back to you when no one else is around. You'd think by now the fear would wear thin, that after 20 sections, the chills would settle, and Annabelle would simply become another tale among many. But no. She stays sharp, precise, like a pin hidden in the fabric of your thoughts, because her story doesn't just persist, it adapts. Let's dive into something rarely discussed, a theory that hovers between folklore and metaphysics, the familiar thread hypothesis. This concept suggests that some haunted objects don't seek out people randomly. They return to the ones who've already known them, or rather, versions of them. One man, a woodworker in Oregon, claims he carved a faceless rag doll for his daughter in the early 80s. Simple, stitched by hand, no buttons or embellishments. Years later, after hearing about Annabelle, he says he felt an overwhelming dread, not curiosity recognition. He went into his attic, opened an old toy chest, and found the doll. Only now, it had a face. Red thread for hair, and 2 black buttons where there were once none. He burned it immediately, and yet, a few days later, a doll identical appeared on the passenger seat of his truck, wrapped in a red ribbon. No one else had the key. He keeps it in a locked shed now, buried under tools and iron. Says it hums if you sit quietly enough. A low vibration, not quite sound, but not quite silence either. He's never spoken publicly about it, but his daughter, she says she still dreams about the doll. Only now, she's grown tall. Her arms are longer, her smile sharper, and she calls herself Anne. That's how it happens, isn't it? Tiny shifts, untraceable changes. A little girl's toy that grows alongside her. A childhood object that turns back to look at you. This is where the Annabelle legend gets complicated. Because if she isn't tied to a single doll, if her presence travels through attention and memory and story, then there's no real center, no real origin, only echoes. A well-known paranormal investigator once compared Annabelle to a virus. Not biological, narrative. She doesn't infect the body, she infects belief. Once you've heard her story, really heard it, some small piece of it remains inside you. Not because you believe it all, but because a small part of you does, and that's enough. It's why you might hesitate to look at that doll you keep in your closet, or why you suddenly remembered one from your childhood just now. You hadn't thought about it in years, but it's back, not in your room yet, just in your head, and that's where she likes to begin. The line between memory and manifestation is thinner than we think, and Annabelle, she walks it like a tightrope, never running, never chasing, just approaching. One slow inch at a time. That's why you feel her strongest, not in the loud parts of the story, but in the pauses, the moments when you're waiting for something to happen, when the silence stretches just a breath too long, when the floor creaks and you hope it's just the house settling, when the thought crosses your mind, what if she's already here? And you realize you didn't check behind you before pressing play tonight. By now, the shape of her legend has shifted. Annabelle is no longer just a doll in a case behind protective glass. She's a presence, a rhythm, a question you can't stop asking once it's been planted. Is something watching me, or am I just letting myself believe? And it's that letting the gentle permission of imagination that gives her form. Some stories say you can't actually escape her once you've acknowledged her name aloud. That the moment you engage, not fearfully, but curiously, you open the smallest of doors, not physical, psychic. There's a haunting account, barely known, buried in an old collector's blog. A woman in Arizona inherited her aunt's estate. Nothing strange, just dusty furniture, antique mirrors, old books. Among the items was a plush Raggedy Ann doll, limp and faded from time. No red flags, until she tried to donate it. Every place she brought it to refused it. Thrift stores, shelters, even antique dealers. They all said something vague, uncomfortable. I just don't want that thing here. So she left it in a donation bin and drove away, only to find it, a week later, sitting at the foot of her bed. Not similar, the doll, same tear in the seam, same stitch in the left eye. She burned it. She says it laughed once just before the fabric turned to ash. Now, every December 1st, she finds a red thread in her mailbox. No return address, just the thread. You want to call it coincidence. Your brain needs to call it coincidence. But your instincts, they're a little less sure. Psychologists might say Annabelle is a manifestation of collective unease, a symbol, a proxy for deeper anxieties around safety, control, and childhood innocence turned sinister. But then again, symbols don't move. Symbols don't turn up where they weren't placed, and symbols don't whisper, which brings us to the whispers. Another recurring theme, especially in those who claim long exposure to her story. They start soft, at night, right on the edge of sleep. A girl's voice, not a child exactly, but not quite grown. She doesn't say much, usually just a name. Sometimes yours. They come in patterns too. Threes, mostly. 3 knocks, 3 cold spots, 3 dreams in a row, like a calling card. Or a countdown. Let's say, just for comfort's sake, that Annabelle is nothing more than a vessel. An object that once held something bad, then got locked away. Fine, but what if that vessel over time cracked? Not just physically, but conceptually. What if people's fascination with her was stronger than any containment ritual? Because attention is energy, and energy, when focused long enough, can become invitation. Maybe you've already felt it. The way this story slows your breath just a little, the way you double-check your peripheral vision, the way you keep listening, even when nothing is being said. That's her gift. That's her power. She doesn't do things. She makes you do them to yourself. And the truth is, that's harder to fight. Because how do you defend against a thought? Against a shape that lives just outside the edge of certainty? Against a girl who may not be a girl at all, but a voice stitched together by decades of retellings? You shift under your blanket again. The air feels thicker, not colder, just expectant. Like someone's waiting for you to speak. But it's fine. You don't have to. She already knows your name. You're still here. That alone says something. Most people wouldn't have followed Annabelle this far. Not because they don't believe, but because they do. Just enough. Enough to step away. Enough to think, maybe I shouldn't keep listening. But you've kept going. And Annabelle, she notices. There's a final layer to her legend. One whispered quietly among certain occultists. Not just about the doll, but about what the doll is for. It's called the soft anchor theory. And it suggests Annabelle was never meant to be a prison. She was meant to be a tether. The theory goes that in certain cases, a physical object is deliberately prepared to anchor an entity, not to trap it, but to give it form, a place to focus, to inhabit, to interact. Annabelle, in this version, wasn't possessed accidentally. She was prepared. Not by a spirit, by a person. Someone who knew how to build a home for the thing that followed them. Because sometimes, banishing isn't an option. Sometimes, the only way to survive is to offer it somewhere else to stay. It raises a grim possibility. What if the original doll was never haunted until it was given a name? What if the act of naming her, believing in her, spreading her story, that's what made her real? Not the entity, the idea. The real horror, she doesn't need to exist to haunt you. She just needs to feel possible. And now that you've followed her through all these layers, all these shadowed rooms and whispered encounters, she's no longer distant. She's adjacent, just beyond the veil of your doubt. Some researchers claim Annabelle's case at the museum is more ceremonial than protective. That the prayers on the glass aren't keeping her in. They're keeping us from reaching her. Because at this point, no one's sure where she is. Only that the story keeps moving. And movement means intention. One man who visited the museum claimed he felt nothing while standing in front of the case. No chill, no fear, nothing. But later that night, at his hotel, he spilled water on his shirt and took it off. When he reached for a dry one from his suitcase, he found it already laid out on the bed, pressed, folded, with a red thread on the collar. He hadn't packed anything red. When he returned home, he refused to sleep in his bedroom for 2 weeks. Not because of what he saw, because of what he might have. The fear of catching movement just before sleep. The dread of a soft sound in the corner of the room. The kind of dread that can't be explained to anyone else, only felt. You wonder now if you've already been visited, not by a doll, but by the suggestion of one. That antique shop you hesitated to enter. That dream you didn't remember until just now. That old toy from your childhood that disappeared without a trace. She doesn't leave calling cards. She leaves questions. And the longer you carry those questions, the closer she sits beside you. But take comfort in this. Annabelle doesn't run. She walks, patiently, quietly, because she knows you'll look back, eventually, and when you do, she'll be ready. You've noticed by now, haven't you? How her name lingers. How your thoughts have started to loop, gently, like a carousel tune you didn't ask to hear. That's her final touch, the afterglow. Not fear, exactly. Just presence. Annabelle doesn't need to haunt your room. She haunts your pattern recognition. Let's take a final step into one of the most unsettling theories among those who study legends like hers. It's not about demons or hauntings. It's about attention loops. The idea is simple. The more people talk about her, the more she becomes real. Not in a physical doll on your shelf way, but in the way that shared memory becomes culture. There's a file, hidden deep in a forum long abandoned, once run by archivists who documented anomalous objects. It was titled Abel Manifested Doc. It contained a chilling entry, not about the doll, but about a voice recording. A podcaster in Sweden, unfamiliar with the Annabelle legend, once played a 2-minute sound clip submitted anonymously. It was nothing but soft scratching, barely audible. But after airing the episode, the host received over 50 emails from listeners describing similar dreams. A faceless red-haired girl, a cold hallway, a room with only one window covered by a sheer white curtain. None of these things were described in the episode, yet the details matched. All from people in different parts of the world, different languages, different time zones. That's not coincidence. That's infection. Narrative infection. You're not afraid because she's in your room. You're afraid because she might be in your mind. And you're not alone. Annabelle isn't one story. She's a framework. She's what happens when people decide a shape is dangerous. She's the silhouette that fills in differently, depending on what you already fear. A doll to some, a voice to others, a memory to those who thought they'd forgotten. A psychic once said something that stuck. She's not the haunted one. We are. She just listens. It makes sense, because haven't you noticed? She doesn't scream. She waits. She doesn't move. You find her moved. She doesn't force your belief. She borrows it, just enough to linger. And here, near the end, you realize something else. Annabelle isn't trying to frighten you. She's trying to anchor herself. She's found a way to survive the modern age. Not by becoming bigger, but by becoming quieter. She's the whisper in the age of noise. The red thread on the edge of your vision. You might think you've reached the end of her tale, but endings don't suit her. She thrives in the after, the what-ifs, the shadows between bedtime and dreams. The moment your brain says, it was just a story, and your body answers, then why am I still listening? You get up to turn off the lights, and pause. There's a doll on your shelf you haven't noticed in years. A gift? A childhood favorite? You can't remember. It has button eyes, and as you look at it, you realize it's facing just slightly the wrong way, like it turned, just a little, just enough. This is the part where the story slows down. Not because it's over, but because it's about to nestle somewhere deeper. The final stretch, the quietest corner. The part that doesn't scream or shiver, it simply waits. And so does she. There's one last version of the Annabelle story. It isn't popular. You won't find it in books or movies or museum pamphlets. It's shared only in whispers, and only with people who already believe, even if they don't know they do. It's called The Closing of the Eyes. The tale goes like this. If you ever dream of Annabelle, and she stares directly at you, don't close your eyes. Don't blink. Don't flinch. Because if you do, she's allowed to move, not toward you, but into you. That's the fear, isn't it? Not of being hurt, but of being changed. Of waking up and realizing something is off. The way you remember things, the way your reflection lags half a second too long, the way your thoughts pause in places they never did before. One woman who claimed this dream said she didn't see the doll. She was the doll, seated on a shelf, unable to move, watching through stitched eyes as people walked by, oblivious to her presence. She woke up and cried not out of fear, but recognition. She said she remembered sitting there. For years, the museum says Annabelle hasn't moved in decades. But that doesn't matter anymore. Because now, she doesn't have to. She moves through stories, through memories, through moments of doubt. She's the pause in your sentence, the flicker in your peripheral, the dream you almost remember until you try too hard. And you, dear listener, have become part of it. This long, winding tale, you followed every step. You opened every door. And whether you meant to or not, you invited her in. But maybe that's okay. Because Annabelle doesn't demand much. Just a glance, a whisper, a thought that lingers a second too long. She's not here to hurt you. She's here to stay remembered. So, tonight, as you curl beneath your blanket, and the room settles into silence, and the light from your screen fades, you'll think of her, not with fear, but with awareness. And somewhere, in some shadowed corner of a forgotten attic or dream space, she'll feel that. She'll know her story still matters, because you were listening, and now, she's listening too. The night wraps itself around you now like a warm, heavy quilt. The air is soft, still, filled only with the low hum of distant things, your breath, the gentle creak of settling walls, the memory of words whispered slowly into the dark. Annabelle's story doesn't need an ending. It's content to drift, like mist curling at your window, waiting to return when you least expect it. Not as a scare, but as a shadow, a knowing, a thread quietly stitched into the edge of your dreams. You feel safe though, don't you? Because this has all been a story, a bedtime tale, a carefully folded legend passed from one quiet voice to another. Nothing more. But as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts grow looser, you may wonder just for a moment if you've heard this story before, or dreamed it, or lived it, or maybe, just maybe, if you're part of it now. It doesn't really matter, because the night is long and the shadows are gentle. And Annabelle, she's patient, so rest easy. Now, there's nothing under the bed, nothing in the closet, just quiet, just stillness, just you, and the story that came to visit. Sleep well,